The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
It is Tuesday, December 24th, 2019. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the five-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live to tape steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it's our vacation week best of 2019, which in some instances, I believe, actually will involve a show from 2018 because we actually run a fiscal best of year from November to November. There's a lot of regulations involved in that. That's one of the big problems with big government these days is that they regulate the hell out of best ofs for podcasts. And so we have no control over that. However, we do have control of what we are presenting today. That is a repeat from January 23rd of 2019, going all the way back to the first month of the year. Tressie McMillan Cottom came on the program. Her book, Lower Ed, the for-profit college scam. Cottom is an assistant professor of sociology at Virginia Commonwealth University and author of Thick and other essays. And we sat down with her. Well, I'm always sitting down, and I don't know what she was doing. She was on the phone, so she could have been standing. To discuss her book, Lower Ed, The Troubling Rise of For-Profit Colleges in the New Economy. This is one of my little bailiwicks, for-profit colleges, for a myriad of reasons. It was one of the few things that the Obama administration had unequivocally done well, I think it was to begin the crackdown on these for-profit scams. They didn't go nearly far enough, but they started a trend in the right direction. And literally, the day after Donald Trump won the election, that Wednesday, for-profit colleges' stocks, I'm not talking metaphorically, their stocks on the New York Stock Exchange shot up like a rocket. And I do mean rocket, not an airplane taking off, not even a helicopter. I mean like a rocket. And the reason is because there are differences between, one for-profit college from another. But at the end of the day, they are all largely, to one degree or another, a bit of a scam. Now, I also am of the mind that on some level, business is a scam. I mean, it's all about sort of, not all, but largely about an asymmetric relationship between people who have different information levels. And so there's an assumption about college that I think a lot of these people who go to these colleges have. And Cottom has a really unique perspective on this. She's not just doing this as an academic. She was actually working at one of these schools, and I think she actually was a student too, I think, at one point. I can't remember. This was all the way back in January. You're going to enjoy it. And we're doing freebie week, the freebie last week as a way of encouraging you in many respects to say, like, hey, become a member, because you never know what you could be hearing.
This is what a member show is sort of like. You get the interview up front and then the fun half stuff afterwards.
That's right. And the fun half stuff, man, oof. Talk about fun. So stick around for that. And don't forget, you can support this program by becoming a member at jointhemajorityreport.com. Jointhemajorityreport.com. Check it out. Thank you so much for your support, obviously, this year. And, hey, the AM Quickie, we're doing it almost every day this week. You can find it on the app at majorityapp.com. You can find the AM Quickie there, or you can just go to amquickie.com and sign up. Gives you a roundup of the news, 5 minutes a day. And also, I may hop on the YouTube channel as well. In the meantime, take a quick break. Come back with Tressie McMillan Cottom. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Assistant Professor of Sociology at Virginia Commonwealth University, Faculty Associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, author of 2 books, Thick and Other Essays, and Lower Ed, The Troubling Rise of For-Profit Colleges in the New Economy. Tressie McMillan Cottom, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Sam.
So the for-profit college stuff fascinates me, and the way in which you came about to write of the for-profit college university world is also pretty fascinating. Just let folks know, how you decided to focus on that.
Well, the story is probably less about how I decided to focus on it and why it was possible for me to be doing this project. And I probably started this in 2010, that I seemed to be the only one who kind of wanted to do this project. And I think that is about my personal experience of the for-profit college sector. But I also think that speaks to the fact that there are so few people like me who had ever touched that sector of higher education who were also in that traditional academic world. And so what happened was I was in graduate school, and listen, Sam, I was going to do anything but this project. I wanted to actually study Ronald Reagan, if you can believe that, and instead end up doing this project because as I was working on my doctoral work, for-profit colleges were experiencing this phenomenal boom of enrollment. They were taking in billions of dollars every year from the federal student aid system. And when you start talking about numbers in the billions, people tend to start paying attention. And there was a lot of media scrutiny. There was some growing political scrutiny of the for-profit college sector. But to my mind, there had not been sort of a critical engagement with not just why for-profit colleges were so profitable or so popular, but about who they were enrolling. And I knew a little bit about who they were enrolling and why that mattered because I had, before I had gone to graduate school, I had worked in the for-profit college sector myself as an enrollment officer. And so my experience of it was shaped very much by understanding that not everybody was vulnerable to the for-profit college machine, and also that it was a machine and that we probably needed to better understand why millions of people all woke up at one time and decided that they wanted to pursue a college credential at all costs. And when you went to the for-profit college sector, at all costs was the key term. And
it was almost, literally at one time. In 2000, you had about 400,000 people enrolled in these for-profit colleges. By now, it's over 2 million, is my understanding. So let's just give us a sense of what we're talking about, because you have 2 different types, broadly speaking, that you discuss
right.
And you generalize it by calling the beauty school and the technical, I guess it is. Wait, I had it right here.
Right.
And so tell us what this is and how their funding mechanism works.
Right. I use these as 2 archetypes, and I had experience in actually what I call both of the subsectors of for-profit colleges. So one of the things that I think kind of got lost in our lumping all of the institutions together was a misunderstanding that 2 different sort of phenomena were happening. So on the one hand, you had what had been the sort of historical role of for-profit colleges, which was they mostly provided career, technical certification and training, right? And so that was the certificates that you need that were just probably below a college degree, maybe even below a 2-year degree, but that you needed to become certified in an occupation. So that is a mechanics training, cosmetology school. Those had grown out a little bit into things like what we once used to call maybe secretarial programs, and now tend to think of broadly as administrative or business assistant programs. And then this growth into the healthcare sector. And so things like a certified nursing assistant. That's all of these sort of short-term credentials, usually take you less than 2 years to complete them, but that are necessary requirements for work. I group those under the beauty college paradigm in my book. And those are a little different, and the incentives that people have for attending those schools are a little different than those that are happening in what I call the technical college system, which is the sector that I think most of us were more familiar with in the first decade of the 2000s, because these were the ones that had all the television commercials, right? Strayer University, the University of Phoenix, Capella, and all of those. So these were programs that were starting an overreach that was historically new. They had started reaching into the 4-year degrees and beyond. They are offering graduate degrees in things like clinical psychology and nursing and healthcare. They were offering bachelor's, master's, doctorate degrees, and the incentives for people to pursue those degrees were related to the other part, but they were not exactly the same. And the real growth in the sector, while a lot of it did happen in that beauty college sector, the real growth and the real money, the investment from the private sector, the investment from shareholders and private equity firms, the financial sector was really interested in the growth of that 4-year degree and beyond, the technical college sector, as I call it in the book.
So on one hand, we have sort of what one could consider sort of almost a vocational school. On some level. And the other is this sort of new animal that, and we're talking about Fortune 500 companies here. We're talking, right? Yes, I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars per, in terms of revenue per, year on these companies. And that's really where on some level, like the action is, right? I mean, in that sector. And it's fascinating to me because you really, I mean, I'm quite familiar with sort of some of the dynamics, but you look beyond the dynamics and look at what's going on in society that sort of like bring that about. But before we get to that part, walk people through the business model of a place like one of these technical, what you call technical side schools, because it is, I don't want to say it's a criminal syndicate in my estimation, but it's close. It is close to being the underside of financialization, which is what I would kind of think of it. You know, it is not unlike what we saw happen in the mortgage crisis. Yep. It is not unlike what we are starting to see in the student loan debt crisis, and those things are very much related. And that is that capital looks for something to invest in. And as consumers become stretched and can't do as much consumer buying, right, what becomes profitable are the things that people have to pay for. Now, that's the social part. And so one of the things I'm looking at in the book is, why did all of a sudden everybody need or want a college degree? What was it that was so attractive to the investment class about this 4-year degree and beyond sector that made it so very profitable? That system looks like looking at what is going on in the economic system and the economic structure. Here we talk about the labor market, but also how comfortable or how safe people feel in the economy. What the system is really preying on is how vulnerable people feel in the labor market. Vulnerability became extremely profitable to the for-profit college sector as a solution. It positioned itself as a solution to workers who are feeling economically vulnerable in the labor market. If you thought that your wages were stagnant, which we now know to be empirically true, people's wages have stagnated over the last 25 years. If you thought your consumer purchasing power had declined, well, you weren't crazy. It had declined. But instead of responding to those things with what we maybe would have done, 40 years ago with a sort of social policy response, what we told millions of people was, this is your fault. This is because you're not competitive enough for the new jobs of the 21st century. The only way to prove that you are competitive is to get a degree and to keep pursuing credentials and degrees, and to do that at your own individual cost. And you call this the education gospel. That is correct. It is the gospel that says it doesn't matter what the reality of the economic relationship is, because it is predatory, as you point out. It is preying on predatory in the true sense of the word, which is that it's preying upon people's economic vulnerabilities. The education gospel says, don't worry about those details. Don't worry about what the economic relationship is or the details of the contract you're signing. Education will always pay off because it has always paid off. We were so invested in the gospel that education could never fail you that I think on the social policy and certainly on the political front, we fell down on asking tough questions about whether or not this specific type of education actually paid off for people. And what we know now is that the picture is not very good for whom that educational investment has paid off for. For-profit colleges
are more expensive than most of your traditional not-for-profit college options. Students tend to bear more of the individual costs through student loans, as opposed to, say, grants and scholarships or employee benefits. They take longer to complete those programs, and as it turns out, the labor market doesn't seem to reward it in higher wages.
All right, so let's talk about we should also say that something like when you talk about the schools that you mentioned, these bigger for-profit universities, which are also predominantly online, right? We're talking about something like 95% of their tuition costs are paid via student loans from the U.S. government, right? And
but legally, it's supposed to be we have this 90-10 rule, right? What for-profit colleges are held to is a standard that only up to 90% of their tuition can come from the federal student aid program, and the other 10% is supposed to come from direct tuition payments from either employers or from students. What this is supposed to do is, how this is described is a check on the school's value to the consumer. But 90%, first of all, is still extremely high, and it's only 90% in theory, because what we have found is that many schools, that doesn't include things like GI Bill money, is usually counted in that 10%. And so some institutions, when you count up all of the government subsidized payments coming to them, approach something far closer to, as you said, to about 95% coming from publicly subsidized dollars.
All right, and so give us a sense of demographically who these students tend to be, their age, their background, because they're a lot of these students are similarly situated, right? They're ambitious, but they also don't necessarily have the social the social cash or the networking to enter into what we traditional higher ed schools or be aware, or they can't afford to because they've got to take care of their children or they have other responsibilities.
Exactly. I think the real telling statistic in the for-profit college sector's demographics is in gender, actually. And in the book, I talk a lot about race, class, and gender, but I really think gender is the biggest piece because it tells, I think, exactly that story, Sam, which is this. About 68, anywhere between 68 and 74%, depending on which year you take it, and this hasn't changed much over the last 10 years, of those enrolled in the for-profit college sector are women. Right. This is really a gendered problem that I think really speaks to why people would attend these schools. People are attending them mostly because they, have already been disadvantaged in the paid labor market. We know all of the general statistics and trend lines of how much more credentialed women have to be paid equal salaries in the labor market, how much more difficult it can be for them to have upward mobility into higher income positions. But we also know that bigger story that women tend to be the ones more likely to be caring for children. And when you're talking about the age range of the student, we tend to think of them as quote unquote non-traditional, but that just doesn't always necessarily mean they're older. It usually just means that they are also caring for a child. But when you're talking about people in that position, they're also more likely to be caring for parents. This is a very familiar story for many of us, trapped between caring for children and caring for aging parents. And their economic position then needs to not only take care of themselves, but they are really trying to take care of a whole family, right? And so when they are having problems moving up or getting secure employment in the labor market, they are especially vulnerable to a message that sounds like this. Call today, start school tomorrow, get a degree fast, get a better paying job almost immediately, because that's the message, right? Call today, start tomorrow, change your life. Well, that's the message that would be more attractive to people for whom changing their life means changing the lives for their children, for their elderly parents, et cetera. And that's women. And then when we move from there, of those enrolled in the for-profit college sector, they are more likely to be African American, Hispanic, low-income students. That's not to say that men don't attend, and they certainly do. It's not to say that white students don't attend. But when we're looking at like the typical face, the next time your listeners are maybe looking at those commercials, it's a really good indicator when you look at who they put in the commercials. Right? They're overwhelmingly women who are talking about they're going to do their homework while their kids are asleep. that tells you who they know their ideal typical student is. And those people are particularly vulnerable to that message and are especially vulnerable to taking on student loan debt to pay for that kind of chance.
And we should say that when my understanding of it is, and walk me through this, but there's a quality that reminded me in the way that they get paid. That reminded me of working in commercial radio. The key to commercial radio was always you want to hold people over the first, the next quarter hour. If you could get them past that, and there's a dynamic in these schools that is like this based upon the schedule in which student loans are dished out. Is that right?
That is correct. So the goal of the enrollment machine that I talk about describe in the book is to get students enrolled as quickly as possible. The idea being that the more time and the more opportunity students have to reflect on their decision, the more likely you are to lose them, right? So you wanted to get them, when they called, you want them to come in immediately to sign their paperwork and to get their federal financial student aid application completed as quickly as possible. And I mean, we're talking in many cases within a week, which sounds very odd to those of us who went through like the traditional college system. So that's why I want to put some numbers on this. We're not talking weeks or months. We're talking you call on a Tuesday, you visit on a Wednesday, you're enrolled when you leave Wednesday, and your financial aid paperwork is done by that Friday. Then the next goal there is to get them started in a class as quickly as possible. Depending on when you make that phone call, what we call rolling enrollment dates are going on, meaning there's almost always a new class starting. You're rarely waiting more than 2 weeks to start in the next class. And that was important because the federal student aid system will not pay the tuition until they have what we call butt in seat, right? The student's butt needs to be in the seat. They've got to show up on that first day of class, and the attendance during that first 3 weeks of that first month of school is critically important because that's how the student is then counted for student aid purposes before the check is sent. Right. And then the money, the lion's share of that tuition enrollment comes up front. There's certainly other dollars that come as the student continues on in school, but the student is quite valuable there at the earliest part of that process for that reason.
And then the retention becomes an important metric for these schools, right? Because they want that second check.
Right. Not even so much completion, because there's no bonus for like getting the students completed. There can be a penalty for them not completing, but it is about making sure they are there through the deadline, the cutoff deadlines for the student aid payment.
And so when you were working in admissions, like what kind of data did they provide you with in terms of return on investment? That's what sort of fascinates me, because I feel like if these schools, my understanding is they take a tremendous amount of data about their students as a way of sort of like, how do we market to them? How do we keep them in the seats? How do we get them in the seats? How do we keep? And we're being metaphorical with the seats, right? Because they could theoretically be doing it online.
Right.
But what you never see is 75% of our students end up making 30% more 2 years out after graduation or some figure like that, which would be, that's the key metric, isn't it?
It is. And now this is where I kind of want to be fair. We don't actually have a good metric on that for any of higher education. The problem is it's probably less of a problem if you went to a traditional not-for-profit college, right? So we haven't had to be as dogged about that kind of data. That's actually, I think, one of the weaknesses in our data system that for-profit colleges have exploited. The fact that we have not had great data on employment returns for all students has made it pretty easy for the for-profit college sector to say, well, hey, it's not like we're falling down the job. Nobody has this data. They're right. Don't have the right motivation when they say that. We do not have excellent data on how much a student earns after they graduate. Some of that is the federal system's fault. Some of that is the for-profit college sector's fault. What I will say is I talk to people who manage the marketing data at for-profit colleges, and they have better data than what is often publicly available to us about how the students are doing. It is that they are not compelled to release it, and they do not release it and use it in their marketing materials to the students. What was more common was for us to slide this disclosure agreement across to the students that the U.S. Department of Education has required for-profit colleges to do. They have to usually provide things like disclaimers about your student loan debt. They have to provide disclaimers about the graduation rates and their job placement data. But that usually looks something like this. It was usually about how much people in this type of job would earn. What they didn't usually break it out to say was, this is how much people in this job who got their degree from us have earned. So, for example, you would say, hey, I want to get a certificate in, electrical engineering, and we'd say, all right, we offer that degree program. Here's what people with an electrical engineering certificate earned last year according to the Occupational Outlook Handbook. That's what we would tell them. But we did not separate out and break out, but this is how much students who earn their degree with us are making in said jobs. And that's a level of finesse that very few people have to push back against a college to ask for that level of detail.
And you say that you're convinced that these institutions, as it were, have data on what the return on investment is, at least to some extent. And I mean, I think it's fairly obvious that if it was gangbusters, we'd know about it. Right?
Yeah, that's what I've always said to them. If it's great, awesome, right? You should definitely lead with that information. I've certainly said the same thing.
Right.
And there are some smaller programs and some for-profit colleges that do extremely well, often because they are attached to other type of arrangements, right? They have a direct line, for example, they're training people to work at AT&T, and AT&T has agreed to hire X amount of people. But those are anomalies for the most part. Most of the students who are going through these sort of generalized degree programs are relying on employers to decide whether or not their degree means something. And because of that, they're usually competing with people who have degrees from other places, and their wages often do not look comparable. And I suspect that if most for-profit colleges had data that says that they were doing that significantly better than average, they would certainly advertise it.
I would imagine even if they're doing average, they would advertise it, is my guess. But I mean, I'm not a marketing guy, so I don't know. But and we should say, I mean, just to be fair, I've heard of some programs where you come in and they will your fee, you don't even pay until you make back a certain percentage of your income. I mean, there are programs that are set up better, and I think some of these, I think folks associated with it are striving to, in certain instances. I mean, give me a sense of what the people working there, how much was your awareness as you were sitting there saying, this seems a little weird, that we're not talking about a return on investment, which is why everybody walking through the door is here, right? That is. At a not-for-profit school, some schools, some liberal arts schools, people are there for citizen, I want to be a better citizen, or, I don't have to worry about my finances or whatever it is. But clearly, most of the people walking through that door are like, I'm here because in 2 years, I want to be making 30% more than I'm making today.
Right.
And
that is absolutely fair. I mean, the for-profit colleges themselves say of their marketing data that the number one reason that their prospective students and enrolled students tell them that they enrolled in school or sought out school with them, it was to earn more money immediately, right? So that, the students tend to be making a very sort of rational economic exchange when they attend a for-profit college in a way that is less true in traditional, especially on-campus four-year degree programs, that we have this sort of broader, like you said, liberal arts mission, and where the value of college can then be a bit more subjective. I remember feeling that, I had gone to traditional colleges myself, as did a few of my colleagues there in the enrollment office. So we knew it was different than our own experience. And I remember being troubled by it, and I talk a little about that in the book, but having absolutely no words for describing why I was uncomfortable, right? So these words about things like, social inequality and, who can make take on the opportunity cost of sitting out the labor market to go back to school. None of us had that language. I will say some of us were less concerned with it than others, but I do like to point out, I think everybody there, save for a few sort of extreme cases, fundamentally thought that the education gospel worked. And so if we were offering an opportunity for people to better themselves, if it was costing them a lot of money, that was still better than nothing. Where it did get stickier is that there were admissions people who would say things like, I myself would not go to college this way, right? I wouldn't go to school here, or I wouldn't allow my children to go to school here. But this is still a good option for, quote unquote, other people. And that's where I thought when people felt uncomfortable or were wrestling with those ideas, that's where it usually manifested.
Okay. And this is, that's fascinating because I think there is this sort of quality of like, I don't know, both an ignorance to the sort of the reality of what's being offered and sort of a predisposition to presume there's nothing else that can be done for these folks.
Right.
And that is let's talk a little bit about that part, because the Obama administration started to crack down on some of this by basically saying you're not eligible for student loans, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but you're not eligible for student loans unless you use specific accrediting companies or certain accrediting values, and they said to, I think it was Corinthian and ITT, like your accreditor, that's not real. We don't buy it. And then their loans dried up and their business dried up overnight and they had to close. But that was insufficient because why?
Well, it doesn't solve the big problem, right? So, we can think of this in our own lives. The grocery store closing down, the grocery store you really like closest to your home closes down. It doesn't solve the problem that you need groceries, right? The real root of the problem was the demand, not the supply. And I would point out about these schools that did rely significantly on federal student aid dollars. And once they lose their accreditation, you tend to lose then your ability to offer student aid. And that's pretty much the end of usually any for-profit college school, as it would, to be fair, for all schools. But the accreditation piece, the Obama administration was becoming more particular about the data they were requiring the for-profit college to provide to judge whether or not they were meeting the threshold of providing a quality education. Now, the for-profit colleges, I should say, debate to the death whether or not that's a fair assessment of them, whether they should be held to that standard or not, and whether the metric is fair. But that is what the Obama administration was doing. What I will say is that what the Obama administration, and really what no administration has done in quite some time, is really wrestle, however, with that bigger problem. There was this recent report that just came out a couple months ago, I think from the Center for American Progress, that said the job skills myth, the job skills have been a myth, right? Yep. Well, that's all I was writing about, what many of us have been writing about for some time, that what we have been telling people, the social inequality problem in the labor market was not about people not having the right skills. And instead of solving that problem and being honest in our political rhetoric to say this is not about employers not having the right skills. This is about employers not wanting to pay fair wages. This is about us not holding employers to task for their tax responsibility. There was a lot at play. And I will say that nobody had really hit on the political rhetoric that I think solved the problem of demand. And that was why for-profit colleges remain somewhat popular with people. Demand has not dried up because there's still a demand for a good quality of life with good wages. And they're still making that promise.
And we should. I want to be really explicit about this so people understand. So the myth was that there was a mismatch in our workforce with their education, and all the research now shows. A big report came out very recently, and I think it was from the Center for Economic Progress. But I'm not. Regardless, regardless, it basically showed that in fact what was happening is, as it became more of a buyer's market for employers, they just got more narrow in what they would accept from people rather than certain skill sets being needed. But we're also talking about people who are already employed more often than not, right? When you're going to these schools.
That's right.
These are people who just want to get better wages and be able to care for their families. So we have not so much of a lack of employment situation, but rather poor pay for people who are doing decent work.
That is right.
And so we had this. I mean, on some level, I feel like the educational story in this sector is not terribly different than when we see education in the context of K through 12, insofar as we're looking at schools to deal with societal ills that are really not in their portfolio.
That is correct. And that is really the big story and the tougher story, frankly, right? People don't like the story. When I say people, it's, I think it's hard for politicians. I think it's hard for policy people to get a good story. We're just so deeply invested in the narrative. But the real story here is that it is not just possible, but now I think we can empirically argue that it is true that colleges cannot, and school K through 12 or K through 16 cannot solve these larger social ills. That the real problem of wages was never about the human capital of the workers working in jobs. And so when you told people that story, all you did was make them very valuable to the financial sector, who were able to exploit that fear by selling credentials. But that does not solve the problem that what workers are really facing is a really tough path to not just a good job, but what we would call internal mobility, the promotions over time, for your wages to increase over time. When you work at a job and after 5 years that you should be earning more than when you started. Those kinds of problems are not human capital problems.
And we should say, I mean, it's interesting what's implicated here, because the access to government loans clearly drove up the prices of these places, right? Because they're basically fixing their tuition as a function of that 90-10 rule. Like we're going to make our tuition cost 10% more than whatever is available for people in terms of government loans. And that dynamic, of course, would be fixed and in many respects reversed if we, instead of having a massive loan program, we provided at least one or two free options per state, but that's maybe a separate issue. But I want to...
No, I don't think it's a separate issue. I actually think it's a super important one, Sam. It's one of the ones that I argue for, that the real competition, we thought that the competition that needed to happen in the higher education, quote unquote, market was that you needed more institutions. And that's what we saw happen from the 1990s to 2010s, when we created tons of new institutions. But as long as the student aid system is underwriting all of those institutions the same, that's not actually creating more competition. They would just increase the size of the pie and just take in more students. That's what the for-profit college sector really was. Real competition would come through true, accessible, affordable options. And the only people who can do that, the only entity that can do that is the state. And so I actually believe that's the real solution.
Interesting. And so let me ask you this, and just as we broaden this out, because I want to just touch on your, and I will confess to not having read Thick yet, but I will also say it is right on the top of my list of things to read. How
That's acceptable.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you for that. But I mean, how the issues that you talk about in Thick, I mean, to the extent that I know what it's about, is addressing your experience largely, and also I think the experience of other people who are within our society, who are in folks who are similarly positioned, who may be targeted because they're the most vulnerable, particularly when they feel this pressure economically or by race or by gender. Draw the connective tissue between these two books for me.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, because to me the connective tissue was always there, and I laugh sometimes when I did have to do this with the publisher, going, no, to me this is all part of the same story. When they asked me to sort of position the book, in many ways, my thinking about Lower Ed started with asking a very basic question, which was, wow, a lot of these for-profit colleges have a lot of Black women enrolled. Why is that? And by starting from there, you got to all of these larger issues, not because there was something unique about Black women, but there was something unique about when a predatory system is built, it almost always starts with the most vulnerable people in a society. That's how predation works. And so if for-profit colleges were a predatory economic arrangement, which I argue that they are, it made sense that it would start by serving parts of the population that were poorly served by other institutions. So that means women and people of color disproportionately. So my questions start there, and one of the larger arguments of the new collection of essays where, I take that through looking at technology, I take it by looking at popular culture and policy and media, is that story is true over and over again. And that what we learn when you pay attention to who is most vulnerable in the system, you understand the system better. One of the reasons why I think I was able to write lower ed and it hadn't been written before by someone else is that you do get a clarity about how a system is working when you look at its weakest points, right? So I was able to say, look, there's something here about the relationship between student loan money and economic insecurity and labor market changes. There has to be something here because look at what's happening with this subset of people. And in many ways, all I'm saying across this collection of essays is that reveals a lot of important information about our system, no matter what part of the system that we're looking at.
To what extent do Black women in particular, because you note that they are in many respects the most, or at least one of the groups that is most susceptible to these type of predatory, specifically because they're not being served by other institutions.
Right.
To what extent is there an awareness of that as a systemic problem? And I ask only because I've talked to people who've done ethnographies of people who've lost their homes in foreclosure in the wake of the foreclosure crisis. And there wasn't necessarily a big understanding that their experience was not unique, that it wasn't a function of the decisions that they had made, but rather it was a function of decisions that had been made by people they didn't know. What is your sense of that of the awareness of those folks as being in this predicament because of the system, rather as opposed to decisions that they have made?
Yeah, I think that just overall, we have a real paucity of language to talk about systems thinking, right, in our culture. And we see this over and over again when we talk about, who are these stupid people who signed up for these bad loans, right? And then it'll take us 10 years of excavating the whole mess to find out that one didn't need to be stupid. One needed to just be there and need a home because there was all of this other stuff happening around them that foreclosed upon good decisions, right? It's not that people are often just making the poorest decision available. It's that lots of decisions are foreclosed upon for you. The reality is, if you want to, for example, go to college in the United States of America today, it helps a lot if you have always had people who are pushing you to go to college, if you had access to well-funded, equitable K-12 schools, if you had access to a safe, secure home in a safe neighborhood, if you had good nutrition, and then if you could make it to the finish line with a high school diploma, knowing about all of your college options and have all of the money and the time in the world to apply. Well, those types of decisions, if you're 24 and you didn't have those things, nothing about your decision-making at 24 is going to override the 23 years that preceded that year, right?
Right.
Those certain options are foreclosed upon for you. And that's what I mean about systematic thinking and thus not having a really good language to talk about it in popular culture. It is an easier story to write, to say, oh, X person, right? Lisa decided X, and look at how horrible her life is. That's an easier story to write than it is to write this big, sprawling story. But that's where the reality is and where we can usually affect the most change, by understanding why do some people have some options and not others.
Right. But I wonder how much of an awareness is there of that within amongst, let's say, Black women, that it is.
Yeah. I don't know that we are different than most Americans in that we don't have much language to talk about that either. I think one of the stunning things that came out to me in the interviews I did for lower ed was how many of the students absolutely blamed themselves. Even when we would then talk in detail about, their biography and what had brought them there. And this just shows up in lots of social science work over and over again. Poor people, for example, writ large, tend to blame themselves for their own poverty. right? Over and over again, we see that kind of language. And I think that's precisely because Black women, like most people in this country, just don't have a language to talk about the system's thinking. And if we look around, I mean, there are not a lot of politicians, certainly, who are good at talking about it.
Well,
I don't know that a lot of
there are plenty of politicians. I mean, at the very least, we have at the very least one party that is completely 100% committed to making the argument that it is a failure of personal responsibility. Right. But the fact is that, the Democratic Party, even Barack Obama, the idea of personal responsibility, took the forefront a lot more than any notion of a systemic failure. Absolutely. I mean, I take that to task actually quite a bit in an essay in the new book about the Barack Obama administration was not a departure from that language. No. He embraced wholeheartedly the idea of, cultures of poverty that create people who abdicate responsibility for themselves. And I want to be clear that, of course, there's always some individual choice, and of course, there's always individual agency. What I argue, and what lots of people like me have argued, is that we overstate how much that can change people's circumstances, while completely obscuring all of the structural stuff. There's, like you said, one party who is just ideologically opposed to the idea of a system or structure. And then on the other side, there's a party who has to sometimes give lip service to it, but that increasingly feels the need, because they're chasing some mythical center party, center voter, feels the need to double down on the idea of personal responsibility. So we really don't have a political party, a major political party, that is dedicated to using very precise language about some of the horrible predatory behaviors that happen to us in our systems. Tressie McMillan Cottom, author of Lower Ed, The Troubling Rise of For-Profit Colleges in the New Economy, and Thick and Other Essays. I want to have you back on after I read the Thick. I hope you'll make it.
I will do that. I'm going to hold you to it, in fact, Sam.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really great stuff. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Let's first go to the Fox News Bernie Town Hall. Play a couple of clips from there. This is it's clip number 3, where we had mentioned earlier that Bret Baier had to sort of maintain some semblance of being the straight news guy. And so I am not going to feel quite as humiliated when I take a survey of the audience and find that everything I've been promoting on Fox News for over a decade is not popular with the people who are here for some reason. Now, this town hall was in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I mean, if you had told me that this was done at the auditorium at the University of Vermont, and that I would have been like, oh, that makes sense. But this audience, I don't know if Fox News doesn't have a lot of attention, but this audience seemed to be incredibly amenable to Bernie Sanders and his policies, which theoretically have been maligned on Fox News for ages. And here, Martha McCallum, and I think this is getting towards the end of the thing, where there's, I think these two hosts are got to feel like we have in some way failed, because we're not getting that moment or the series of moments where we have exposed Bernie Sanders for either having policies that don't make sense or having policies that are not popular with this broad section of people. And so I think there's a lot of frustration involved in this. And you can see Martha McCallum, and just play this exchange.
About Vermont, because Vermont tried to have a single-payer program, and in 2014, the Democratic governor abandoned it because he had to raise income taxes, had to raise payroll taxes, and the people of Vermont didn't want their taxes to go up.
No, it's not quite true.
And they abandoned the program. So if you work in Vermont,
you're getting into internal Vermont politics, of which I know a little bit.
Well, I'm sure you do.
I don't want to be. All right, the governor did a rather poor job, but I think if you look at polling, especially among Democrats, as I'm sure you have, you tell me. Strong majority of Democrats and more than a few Republicans want to see a Medicare for all program. What the opponents, and let's be clear about this, Martha. When you are dealing with health care, which is, 18% of our GDP? I mean, we're talking about $3.5 trillion a year. And you have insurance companies that make billions and billions of dollars in profit. Let me give you an example, if I might, of the dysfunctionality of the current healthcare system. Recently, Aetna merged with CVS. You may recall that. Big merger, which in my view will drive healthcare costs up. The gentleman who was head of Aetna's named Mr. Bertolini. Do you know what he got for putting together that merger? He got a $500 million bonus. Do you think that's how we should spend healthcare dollars?
I mean, I think everybody is in agreement that healthcare needs to be fixed in this country. The question is how. And my question to you was, it will drive up taxes to pay for healthcare. And not just the wealthy will pay for that. The middle class will also pay for it.
Very good.
So how do you justify it? And
all right, Martha, what are you not including in your discussion?
You tell me.
I will tell you. You're not going to pay any health insurance premiums. But look, Martha,
whether it's in your income tax or your payroll tax, you're going to pay.
Look, healthcare is not free. You never heard me suggest that we're going to magically.
You just said it was going to be free for everyone.
It's going to be free at the point of when you use it. Okay? And you go to. Why are you so shocked by this?
Because someone's going to pay.
Somebody is going to pay.
Who are they? Who pays?
Okay. One second.
Okay,
relax.
I'm just asking.
We'll be talking.
Please.
We'll get through this together.
It's a common question. We had so many email questions. Ask Senator Sanders how he is
fair
going
enough.
to pay.
I got it.
It's a fair
But
question.
the first thing, let's just say hypothetically.
Okay.
You are self-employed, and you got a husband and 2 kids. Okay, family of 4. Do you know how much that family is paying today for health care?
How many?
$28,000 a year.
Okay.
All right, we're spending $11,000 per person. We are saying to that family of 4, you ain't going to pay that $28,000. You're not paying any more premiums. You're not paying any more co-payments. You're not paying any more deductibles. How's that? $28,000 you're not paying. But does that mean you're not going to pay something? Of course it does. You're going to pay more in taxes.
And do members of Congress who now have gold-plated health
Pause it for 1 second.
Now,
this is really sort of fascinating, right? Because that you can almost see Martha looking like a little bit flush there, right? She doesn't have anything else to say. He's just conceded what she thinks is the sort of the stake through the heart of this program, where he says, yeah, no, of course, you're going to pay more in taxes. You're going to pay less for premiums. That is the easy calculation here. And there has been, and the thing is that there has been no one who has been able to produce a report. There's been no research. There's been no estimates. Even the Mercatus study from the right-wing think tank, there has been nothing released by anyone who can refute that central dynamic. And the thing that Bernie is doing that is different from when they talked about where in Vermont it failed was a Governor Schulman, I think it was his name. The thing that Bernie is doing, and we used to get calls from John from San Antonio would call in all the time about this very point, is that you must lead with the idea that taxes are going to be raised, because taxes are going to be raised. And Bernie makes the point. It is free at the point of service, and it is free when you pay for it. But it's not free. You're going to have to pay for it. It's going to be in taxes. And middle-class people, as well as wealthy people, are going to pay more in taxes. But the net expenditures are going to be less because you're not going to be paying for premiums and for basically the profits and the inefficiencies in the private insurance market. And then, it doesn't even bring up the fact that and then the other good news is you're not going to have to deal with a tremendous hassle. I have spreadsheets. I have Google Drives that I take pictures of Saul's eye therapy, and I take the pictures and I upload them, and then I see if my insurance is going to pay for them, and I got decent insurance. All right, good.
But does that mean you're not going to pay something? Of course it does. You're going to pay more in taxes.
And do members of Congress who now have gold-plated health insurance?
No, we don't.
Well, they have a special plan that's outside Obamacare. A different plan. Do members of Congress...
Pause it for 1 second. You know who has a plan that's outside of Obamacare?
Most people.
Almost everybody. The only people, it's 10 million people in this country who have a plan inside of Obamacare. And you have something like 280 million people covered by insurance in this country.
By the way, unless you want to define Obamacare as Patient Protection Act, in which case everybody's covered by it and everybody loves it.
Well,
you can't
Congress
discriminate
has
against me
a different health care thing, just like Brett Baer has.
No, I understand that. I'm just saying if he's using it, and of course we know that in terms of actual plans, but the patient protection component of it is national and protects a lot of people.
Yeah, he's talking about the exchanges
conditions.
here.
I think that's what he's trying to talk about.
Obamacare has more than that, just the exchanges.
Right. Well, it's Medicaid too, but the real question is why is Brett Baer bringing this up now? Because Bernie has now destroyed McCallum's one critique, and so he's pivoting to we can't really trust Congress people because you guys you're out of this whole system. You're going to try and be out of this whole system. That's where he's going with this. Go back a little bit, and you'll see they have now gone from the Alamo to the next redoubt, right? Where it's okay, we're going to go to the farthest reaches of the Alamo because we need to figure out some way of undercutting this, and it's the classic. Well, we can't trust government, and because politicians all lie.
It does. You're going to pay more in taxes.
And do members of Congress who now have gold-plated health insurance?
No, we don't.
Well, they have a special plan that's outside Obamacare. A different plan. Do members of Congress, are they going to do that transition as well?
Damn right. Of course. Of course.
Whoops.
But I want to make the point.
Bummer.
I want to get back to
Pause
the
it.
point.
Now, this is where Brett Baer, if he's really on his game, or McCallum, if she was really on her game, she's going to go, well, because this is the last refuge is, how many pages is it? Because that was the way that it went with Obamacare. Right? There was a problem with the program, and then it was but congressmen aren't going to put themselves in it. And then it was over 100 pages. Literally, this was a talking point at the time. In that Glenn Beck rally I went to, one of the common complaints about Obamacare was nobody knows what's in it. And they passed it. It's over 100 pages. There shouldn't be anything. Everybody's just saying 4 pages. That should be the top.
This will probably be a shorter bill.
Yeah,
exactly. A shorter bill.
Come at me, bro.
Of course. Why would you suggest otherwise? But I want to make the point. I want to get back to the point that Martha raised. Look, healthcare costs money. Every other country, or virtually every country, does it in the same way we do education for our kids. Okay, when a kid walks into school, kid doesn't have to take out a credit card, right? It's paid for out of public funds. That's what most countries do. So if you're asking me, if your question is a fair question, are people going to pay more in taxes? Yes. But at the end of the day, the overwhelming majority of people are going to end up paying less for health care because they're not paying premiums, co-payments, and deductibles.
We're going to get it.
Yeah, there we go. Well, we got to take a break.
Look at that. Look at that. Look at the face. Look at that. Look at that. I think I handled that pretty well.
Yeah, there you go.
Smooth Bernard
Come
strikes
at me.
again.
That's the great. What I love about Bernie is some people contrasted spin with complexity, right? If you're speaking in spin and sound bites, then you're not acknowledging how complicated these issues are. He's great because it actually is super simple, and he has great message discipline, but it's also clear and honest and direct.
But the key is what John from San Antonio would call in years ago to complain about.
So I said clear and honest.
Leading with the taxes. Yes. And there was an attempt by, I think, Democrats for a long time. And part of it was, back in the day, like Walter Mondale and whatnot, was, if you say you're going to raise taxes, the American public is necessarily going to have a problem with it. As if there is no argument, as if the American public cannot understand the concept that right now you're paying $10 for something, and we're going to eliminate that $10 expense, but it will cost you $6.
And didn't also Mondale, didn't he like sort of basically say like we're going to just taxes as austerity to pay off the deficit or something? If I've heard that correctly, it was not presented as.
It was something like we need to pay for things.
Yeah, it wasn't like presented as part of an ambitious agenda to take care of things for people.
There was no agenda, as far as I can tell.
And for what it's worth, you think of Obama, they soft pedaled Obamacare costing something. And I'd be much more pissed about having my premiums jacked up than having my taxes jacked.
Oh, yeah. Or, getting a kind of not that good silver plan and finding out it still costs $100 if I need to go to the doctor for a sick visit, which is a thing that happened to me.
Yes. And so this was by leading with that taxes. It also makes his job, frankly, easier because other people have to try and hide the ball. And he's not trying to hide the ball. He's trying to say, like, look at the ball. It's a good ball.
Ben Shapiro has the reputation of being a great intellectual. Now, I'll say that I am actually dealing with his new book because I have to write a chapter about him for my book. And one of the themes of my book is that this whole modern right-wing sort of frame and IDW is a massive fight against historicity in general. And while obviously Sam Harris is structurally ahistorical and Jordan Peterson has his, mythology over history kind of thing, I would argue. Ben Shapiro does like, I don't even know, it's like 1950s Reader's Digest sort of cartoon. I guess if like a seventh grader watched like Red Dawn or something and got like a quotable book of classics. I don't know.
If he
it's
wasn't
very dumbed down stuff.
If he didn't start as a teenager and instead was just like a 40-year-old National Review editor with his exact same opinions, he'd be utterly unremarkable.
Well, and I think a lot of people think that, Jonah Goldberg sort of had a reputation of being a, not bright guy, but a guy who, had pretensions of intellect, but was sort of broadly understood to be, a nepotism case with a very limited capacity. So here is Ben Shapiro. He's talking to Andrew Neil. Now, Andrew Neil is a quite right-wing figure in a British context. I believe he's the editor of The Spectator.
He's something
chairman of The Spectator.
Yeah, chairman of The Spectator.
Spectator's right-wing.
Yeah, but don't blame him for The Spectator writing puff pieces about Golden Dawn, for instance.
Because he's not in editorial control.
Yeah, that's what he said. Owen Jones went after him for that, and Andrew Neil's like, I don't don't put that on me. I'm only the chairman of the whole magazine.
Sure, okay, but he's yes, a man of the right, but he's able to do. I mean, this is just a British interview. If they interviewed any of us, they would go like, "You say you support socialism, however, socialism has killed millions, so." You want people to die, but Ben Shapiro's in his bag. He's triggered. He's in his feelings, and he's also just what a whiny little thing. Let's check this out.
It is intellectual sneering of the highest order to suggest that only the left has new and decent ideas.
Some of the ideas that are popular in your side of politics would seem to take us back to the Dark Ages, Georgia, new abortion laws, which you are much in favor of, that a woman who miscarries could get 30 years. A Georgian woman who travels to another state for an abortion procedure could get 10 years. These are extreme hard policies.
Well, okay, a couple of things. One, I'm not sure. I mean, frankly, I don't know whether are you an objective journalist or are you an opinion journalist?
I'm a journalist that asks questions.
Okay, so you're a supposedly objective journalist calling policies with which you disagree barbaric and suggesting only one side of the political.
I will just remind you that we highlighted a case a couple days ago of an 11-year-old rape victim who is pregnant and, as that law is currently written, could be forced to carry that baby to term. I don't know what other word you would reserve barbarism for, let alone imprisoning women for, exercising control over their health. I mean, to say the least. But, but Ben, again, he's getting very triggered and freaked out by this. And this is just so interesting. I mean, this is an entire brand that was built off of going to a college campus and, superficially through word tricks and gamesmanship, eviscerating some 18-year-old who asked them a question. And he can't even deal with one just sort of basic round of British questioning, which anybody who has it's kind of stunning that Ben Shapiro has this little exposure to British media as it seems to, appear. But anyways, go ahead. The abortion one will continue, but this is the beginning of a prolonged tantrum.
Barbaric and suggesting only one side of the political aisle has ideas. So I just want to point out that I wish you would at least be honest in your own biases.
Mr. Shapiro, I know that broadcasting in America is now so polarized that on one program you only have the left and another one you just have the right. My job is to question those who have strong views and put an alternative to them. If you were an anti-abortion person, I would be putting pro-abortion questions to you. But you are
really would you call the pro-choice position?
So why don't you just answer my question,
sir? I'm happy to answer your question. Please answer this one. Would you suggest that a late-term abortion is brutal?
I'm not taking a view on this issue. I'm asking you the question.
I want to pause it here and bring in our friend Timba on Toast and his section from this Dave Rubin's Battle of Ideas Part 3. Right. Explains exactly the little move that Ben Shapiro does called the Mott and Bailey.
This is really
Analyzing the things Stefan says is a fallacy called the Mott and Bailey. The phrase Mott and Bailey comes from medieval castles which had a particular structure. A gated courtyard area outside, the bailey, where the main settlements were, and then a heavily fortified stone keep high up on the hill, the motte, where everyone would retreat to when hostile forces approached. The bailey is vulnerable, open to attack, but the motte is safe, unassailable. The Mott and Bailey fallacy revolves around trying to defend a controversial position, a bailey, by defending a loosely connected common sense assertion which is impossible to argue against, a motte. An example of this would be if I said that women don't belong in the workplace, and then when asked to defend my position, I said, you can't deny that there are biological differences between men and women. You can see how the two concepts here...
So you see, that's exactly what he's doing, pivoting from this bill to the specific question of late-term abortion. Now, I don't know how he's defining late-term abortion, but we do know that, quote-unquote, late-term abortions in terms of, like the baby's about to be due are performed only in instances where the mother's life is at risk, period. And we also know that Donald Trump and others are running around the country just lying about killing babies after they're born. So I don't know what kind of spin Shapiro's trying to do on this, but he did a Mont Bailey, and he's also being disingenuous about what that actually means. And I also would like to say, in terms of the sacredness of life, we'll get to what Ben Shapiro said about Trayvon Martin after the rest of this clip.
You suggest that a late-term abortion is brutal.
I'm not taking a view on this issue. I'm asking you the questions.
Sir, you just suggested the pro-life position is inherently brutal and terrible, so I'm asking you, as an objective journalist, would you ask the same question to a pro-choice advocate by calling their position brutal and horrible?
What I'm asking you is that why is it that a bill banning abortions after a woman has been pregnant for 6 weeks is not a return to the Dark Ages? What's your answer?
My answer is something called science. Human life exists at conception. It ought to be protected. Now, back to my question to you. You purport to be an objective journalist. BBC purports to be an objective down-the-middle network. It obviously is not. It never has been. And you, as a journalist, are proceeding to call one side of the political aisle ignorant, barbaric, and sending us back to the Dark Ages. Why don't you just say that you're on the left? Is this so hard for you? Why can't you just be honest?
Mr.
Seriously,
Shapiro,
it's a serious question.
Mr. Shapiro, if you only knew how ridiculous that statement is, you wouldn't have said it. So let's move on.
I also love because it's like Ben Shapiro has built this whole like ludicrous, sad brand of like, this sort of like faux, this ridiculous posture of sophistication. And he's he's having an exchange with basically what he's sort of indirectly molded this whole dumb persona off of. I mean, I'm sure, he's studied the Buckley tapes and everything, even though he has none of that kind of fluidity. But like, this is what it all comes back to. It comes back to sort of like high Tory sort of like disdain. And he's on the receiving end of it. And he doesn't even know who he's talking to. He thinks Andrew Neil is like labor or something. I mean, this is genuinely mind blowing that this guy has a brand as an intellectual. I just like to remind everybody. I mean, I guess, and I think this is true clearly for a lot of these people, that when they're done, and obviously this is really about controlling women's lives and autonomy and bodies. But even if we were to stipulate, and we never should, but I will for this specific instance, that there's a concern about babies. I don't know when that concern stops, but if you'll remember, several years ago, in 2013, there was an innocent teenager who was killed by George Zimmerman named Trayvon Martin. And Ben Shapiro said, in reality, Trayvon Martin was a fully grown man with a history of violence who got into a fight with a Hispanic man, George Zimmerman, under disputed circumstances, then was shot in the chest while beating Zimmerman's head into the pavement. So he took, of course, Zimmerman's and his lawyer's account at face value. We do know that Zimmerman, a very disturbed person, was following and stalking. I believe Trayvon was only 13 years old, and this child ended up murdered. And then, as Hassan Piker says, Hitler could have been rehabilitated, but Trayvon Martin had it coming. Shapiro. So after embarrassing himself by throwing that tantrum and asserting that he was talking to some type of anti-conservative journalist, the interview went on until, and we're cutting some of it. The whole 8 minutes is pretty funny and revealing. But,
the full thing is actually 16, so we're actually missing out quite a bit of this. Okay. But this is the last.
This is the last. This is when we finally have our. This is when the. How dare you, sir? And read one of Ben's thriller novels to really show, because he had to show what it was.
The sirs are really flying.
The sirs are flying.
As you say in your book, you say that there's quite a key phrase: we are so angry at each other right now. But as I say, aren't you part of that anger? Aren't you encouraging that anger? For example, you described Mr. Obama's State of the Union address in 2012 as fascist mentality in action.
Well, I think that if you want to argue with the characterization, then we can talk about what exactly his State of the Union address said. Is it charged language in politics? Sure. The problem that I have is not with charged language in politics, which I'm generally in favor of. I like a robust public debate and a very loud and spirited public debate. I have no problem with that whatsoever. What I'm talking about is the assumption that people with whom we disagree politically are inherently of bad character, or, in your words, want to bring us back to the dark ages.
But again, it was your description of the State of the Union address in 2012 as fascist.
The wording of President Trump's 2012 address was
He's so
bad and wrong.
That's all. There are plenty of things that are bad and wrong, but it doesn't make them fascist.
Well, I suppose that's true. But if you'd like to read me the column out loud.
That was logic. Andrew Neil just gave him a little A+B there.
If you'd like to read me the column out loud, I suppose I can critique it for you.
Oh, well, again, with Mr. Obama, you said, and you're Jewish yourself. I only mention that because, to put this in context, the Jews who vote for Obama are, by and large, Jews in name only. Ginos, you call them.
My statement was based on the fact that Jews in the United States, as an ethnic group, are largely irreligious, which is true by every single poll. Jews are the most irreligious group in the United States. As an Orthodox Jew who actually takes Judaism seriously, the point that I am making is that most Jews who are ethnically Jewish are not religiously Jewish in any context.
No. The point you were making is that Jews who vote for Obama are Jews in name only.
I said that, yes, that is correct, that Jews who voted for Barack Obama, a progenitor of the Iran deal, a person who was cracking down on religious liberty, a person who spent much of his career as president of the United States attempting to deprive Israel of the necessities to defend itself.
Pause it. I'm sorry. I mean, there's just a few things in this torrent of lies and bullshit. Okay. Unprecedented funding for Iron Dome as an example, right? Ehud Barak said that no other president had done more in terms of security cooperation than Barack Obama. And those of us who actually care about Palestinian civil rights and self-determination were appalled by the Obama administration's endless support of Israel, no matter what they did, including at 2 different times during the transition in 2009 and then in 2014. Such ferocious bombardments on Gaza that even in 2014, Joe Scarborough questioned, as an example, when Israel bombed a UN school. So, again, crackdowns on religious liberties and all this. I mean, he's talking about pharmacies needing to be able to give women the day after pill. Okay, so he's using this maudlin, melodramatic, disingenuous language. But at some point, we need to inject a little bit of reality. Also, the Iran deal, supported by sane people in Israel like Ehud Olmert and the intelligence and members or former members of the intelligence and military apparatus. Go ahead.
The necessities to defend itself. That people, Jews who voted for President Obama, by and large, cared about Judaism far less than they did about other priorities.
Did you say they should turn their badge in as a Jew?
Yes, I believe that if you are somebody who takes Judaism seriously, that comes along with ideological commitment.
I mean, I guess.
Also, I hope you're having fun, by the way, going through every old tweet that I've ever sent to try and do gotcha questions. But if you'd like to have a discussion about my general philosophy or things I've done in, say, I don't know, that's 2012, so it's now 2019. If you'd like to discuss something I've done in, say, like the past 5 years, why don't we do that?
What a whiny little
Because
cretin.
your book is a criticism of how angry America is and how America has to do better. And I'm simply
I have an entire list on my website, sir. On my list, I have an entire website of dumb, bad things that I've said. I'm simply trying to point out some of the things you've said that seem to me to help to stoke that anger. For example, you said Israelis like to build, Arabs like to bomb crap and live in open sewage. Well, as I say in an article entitled, "Here's a list of all the giant, bad, dumb things I've ever said."
Was that dumb?
Yes, that's a dumb tweet. And not only, but it is also important to mention that the next few tweets clarify that tweet is specifically referring to the Hamas leadership, which, by the way, a BBC I've seen is relatively reticent to condemn.
No, actually, it wasn't what you went on to do and say.
But it's just beautiful the way, because he took some dumb, and of course the BBC condemns actions by Hamas. The BBC is quite moderate. It just acknowledges international law and an example in Israel-Palestine. But I just love that Andrew Neil does not even feel the need to go chase that dumb little chestnut. Just like, okay, well, it's back to actually what you were saying.
You can see the dishonesty in Shapiro in that tactic there, right? Because he talks about, he's characterizes the subsequent tweets as if they basically make that tweet not dumb,
right?
And then moves on to make an assertion about the BBC that he thinks Neil is going to follow up instead of that, but Neil impressively stays on the trail.
That the next few tweets clarify that tweet is specifically referring to the Hamas leadership, which, by the way, a BBC I've seen is relatively reticent to condemn.
No, actually, it wasn't what you went on to do and say you are correct about the slur on Arabs. It's not all Arabs that want to live in open sewage and blow things up. It's just Palestinians, you went on to say.
It says the ones who take sides against Israel in the Israel-Palestinian
conflict. The population is rotten to the core, you went on to say. Not Hamas, the Palestinian Arab population.
I say that by poll numbers, they elected Hamas. They educate their children.
Wait, I thought you weren't saying that. So now we're going to justify saying that with the usual litany here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought why do you need poll numbers to talk about the Hamas leadership?
And I thought you were disaggregating from Hamas from the regular Palestinians. But now because they voted for Hamas, maybe they all are actually bad. Ergo, maybe the tweet isn't a problem? What are we saying here, Ben?
The Palestinian Arab population.
I say that by poll numbers, they elected Hamas. They They educate their children in school that Israel should be obliterated, sir.
I guess
if you want to read, honestly, this is a giant waste of time in the sense that the entire interview is designed for you to shout slogans or old things that I've said at me. I don't see how this forwards the debate. You talk about undermining the public discourse. It seems to me that simply going through and finding lone things that sound bad out of context and then hitting people with them is a way for you to make a quick buck on BBC off the fact that I'm popular and no one has ever heard of you.
There are not many bucks to be made on the BBC, unlike American broadcasting, Mr. Shapiro. The point I'm trying to make is that your words are highly designed to produce the consensus and understanding that the book seems to want to produce. That's my point, that you write about, Judeo-Christian culture and so on, but so much of what you've said in the past would seem to turn its back on Judeo-Christian culture.
You're lecturing me on Judeo-Christian culture after you call the pro-life position barbaric?
I just asked you a question.
All he does is evade.
And I asked you a question. You failed to answer a single one of mine. Frankly,
You're
I
there
find
to
this
be
whole thing a
interviewed,
waste of time. If you want to read the book and critique the book, why don't you read and critique the book? If you want to if you want to critique me, you can think whatever you want of me.
Why don't you just
Frankly,
try and
I don't
answer
care.
the
I don't
questions?
frankly give a damn what you think of me since I've never heard of you.
And I've never heard of you until I briefed myself for this. But that's not the issue. You have a
Then
new
why the hell
book
are you
out,
interviewing
and
me, sir?
it's an interesting book. But my point is, your book claims that
Well, it'd be nice if you would quote it from time to time.
Your book is, well, actually, I've done so several times, and I'm about to do so again, if you would let me just finish the question. Your book
frankly, I don't
claims
think
that society
honestly,
is turning its
sir,
back on Judeo-Christian values.
Yeah,
What are
considering
those values? What are the values it's turning its back on?
I'm not inclined to continue an interview with a person as badly motivated as you as an interviewer. So I think we're done here. I appreciate your time, sir.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time and for showing that anger is not part of American political discourse. Now, Mr. Shapiro, we'll say goodbye.
Oh my God.
Ben doesn't like it when context isn't provided for certain tweets and things like that. Man.
Wow.
He's got to be
The era of the pajama boy is over.
Word. And if he's your intellectual leader, you should be fucking embarrassed.
The cool kid's philosopher,
The
baby.
cool kid's philosopher, keeping it
Get out
cool.
those cool kids.
You know what's so funny is I'm not even like I'm sure it would be unpleasant, but it's like so tightly if I get to be interviewed by Andrew Neil for my book and he's like telling me like 2013 you said that Sam Harris, had less braids than Zoolander, but equally less charm than Neville Chamberlain. What do you say that? I would be like, you just made that quote up, but that's awesome. I wish I said that. Could we extend this interview to grill me for another 10 minutes, sir?
Is this just a highlight reel?
This is
That's the fun thing about being like when we're really nasty on Twitter, it's to like fascists.
Right. Exactly. It's the bad people. It's the bad people. That's beautiful. Watch all of it and tweet follow-up questions to Ben respectfully and cordially.
Ben's actually, hold on. Let me bring up Ben Shapiro's Twitter feed because he's been tweeting about this.
Because he's pretty triggered.
Yeah. So basically, he said, he was underprepared for going onto the show.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I would say, just about in general, underprepared.
Oh my God. I remember this other point. He said that he walked out of Breitbart out of principle, and I mean, I guess, sure.
Oh yeah,
that would not be my guess. Just that I think that more of my interpretation would be, whatever.
Here's what Ben said: AF Neil destroys Ben Shapiro, so that's what it feels like. Winky face. Broke my own rule and wasn't properly prepared. I've addressed every single issue he raised before. See below. No, that's not true. As Neil points out,
right. That's why he was talking to you.
Still,
it's Neil 1, Shapiro 0.
And then let's see what else. I think he said something else. I can't find the other one. But
whatever. Ben Shapiro's a bad person. Respectfully follow up with him. You're calling.
Let's start with Meghan McCain. I wasn't going to play this, but apparently Meghan McCain's husband, Ben Domenech, was very upset about it. We won't get to him for a moment.
I just want to say,
and briefly, I think it was his idea to get upset about it, but it's unclear. We should run that through Google to see if he didn't plagiarize that sentiment, but we will check on that in a moment.
I just want to say it's odd because my read is that, and we'll get to him later, that she doesn't love him. That's just my editorial, so it's just odd.
Weird.
If you have my view of the world, it's very strange that he would do that.
So here is Meghan McCain on Seth Meyers' program, and she's not used to people. Well, I guess she is on her show. She speaks to a wide variety of people. But here she is on Seth Meyers, and Seth Meyers is asking her about her comments about Ilhan Omar. Meghan McCain still apparently cannot read because keeps getting these tweets wrong of Ilhan Omar's. I don't know why that is.
Maybe they're so upsetting to her that she can't even read them straight.
Yes. She's also not very bright, to be fair to her.
Well, all right, that's fair.
Legacy admission.
She's obviously now stated she needs to be more careful with her language. Don't you think other people who talk about her need to be a little bit more thoughtful as well? Or do you stand by those comments of tying her to this, her rhetoric to the synagogue shooting?
I don't think I tied her to it in particular. I think that I'm calling out what I see as anti-Semitic language, and when you're talking about
But even after, you called it out after she'd apologized for it. I do want to establish the timeline.
I think that Democrats are hedging on this, and I think it's very dangerous. And I think Chuck Schumer and I are in alignment about Israel's stance in geopolitical politics.
Pause it for 1 second. You know what's super weird about this is that he doesn't bring it up in terms of politics, right? Like, but she makes it immediately partisan. And then she says, but I am aligned with the Democrat. Like, it's
Don't
so
use me as your token Jew. Even I thought that was tasteless.
The Democrats are hedging, but I'm aligned with the leading Democrat.
Democrats are hedging,
with,
and it's not
with
about
the
politics.
leader of the Democrats.
It's not about politics. However, Chuck Schumer agrees.
I think that Democrats are hedging on this, and I think it's very dangerous. And I think Chuck Schumer and I are in alignment about Israel's stance in geopolitical politics. I think it's of the utmost importance, and I think she is bringing her party to the extremism on this. And I think we have to look to Europe and what's happening over there, and that they're, in the British politics, anti-Semitism is very common, and I see it happening over there, and I worry about it happening over here. I stand by every single thing I said, and if that makes me unpopular in this room or in front of you, so be it.
Well, I don't. See, that's a weird thing that you take the position of trying to be unpopular. Here I am trying to, find the common ground on this, because I do think I think we could both agree.
Were you bothered by her language about 9/11?
I thought it was taken out of context, and I think if you watch that whole
Would you
speech,
give President Trump the same leverage if he had said the same thing?
Well, I would say that Donald Trump is certainly in no position to criticize her language on 9/11 based on the things that he said about 9/11, right?
But I just think you have to give people the same credence, and I think...
Now, let's just examine this theory, that you need to give people the same credence. There's no difference between people or context. So, in other words, just all the criticism of Donald Trump is just simply out of context. So if I was Seth Meyer, I would say, well, I mean, does that mean that, like, when Donald Trump says, like, your dad, he doesn't think your dad was a war hero? Like, that's the same? Like, you just, like, if you've ever forgiven anyone for any comment, it's the same thing? I mean, obviously, that's the silliest thing I've ever heard.
Well, I don't know. Maybe you have a different view of geopolitical politics.
But I just think you have to give people the same credence, and I think...
Well, let me make the clarification between Donald Trump and Ilhan Omar is one of them has apologized and said they're going to try to do better, and they're going to be educated by people who know about this. That's what she said, and I think she... it's an interesting thing when we have two Muslim women for the first time. They do have a different perspective on things, and I think when we talk about the idea of, like, let's all try to meet in the middle on things, we have to listen to other people's perspective. And
I agree. I work on The View with Joy Behar every day. I listen to other perspectives all day long.
Is there a way for people to talk...
I'm actually talking to a woman of Italian descent every day on television.
Every single day, there's a co-host who's Italian. She's actually really annoying. My dad would hate her. He did hate her. It's totally unfair. I actually have to talk to her. My father, John McCain, he was in the military. His name was John McCain. And I think he did a lot for this country. I have to talk to her. Every day. She says that poor people should be vaccinated with some taxes from my mom's ninth house. So I listen to that. And I think if you want to give that credence, you have to do that, even if we have different geopolitical politics.
I agree. I work on The View with Joy Behar every day. I listen to other perspectives all day long.
Is there a way for people to talk about differences in Israeli policy without getting framed as anti-Semitic language?
Yeah, I just think you can't talk about Jews hypnotizing the world.
Pause it for 1 second. Guess who did not talk about Jews hypnotizing the world? Ilhan Omar. She talked about Israel, the nation, hypnotizing people in terms of being above critique. And we're literally seeing what she meant by that.
I think we see one of the hypnotized people on that couch.
But Israel, but speaking as a Jew who is a supporter of Israel in a very generic sense, having been to Israel on multiple occasions, Israel and Jews are not synonymous and not the same thing.
And that is in and of itself anti-Semitic to say that they are.
Well, but you don't understand the geopolitical.
Yeah, those are different geopolitical politics. But if you're going to give Sam credence, I think you have to give them the same leverage.
Friends of Joseph Lieberman's daughters of friends of Joseph Lieberman are also Jews.
Yeah.
Is there a way for people to talk about differences in Israeli policy without getting framed as anti-Semitic language?
Yeah, I just think you can't talk about Jews hypnotizing the world, talking about all about the Benjamins.
You keep bringing up the 2 tweets that she's apologized for, and I think that's a little unfair to her, especially because we've established...
Are you her publicist?
What?
Are you her press person?
No, I'm just someone who cares about the fact that there's someone out there who is in a minority, who has had death threats against her, and I think that we should all use the same language that you're asking her to be careful about her language, and I would ask everybody else to be careful about theirs.
Okay, all right. I mean, I'm not sure what would make you happy coming out of my mouth right now? I'm genuinely curious.
I'm perfectly happy with everything that's coming out of my mouth, and I like that we spent this time together.
Okay, you seem a little. I mean, I think my opinions are very strong, and I think sometimes because
that is coming across. I do want you to know that.
Oh my God!
You got it, Seth Meyers.
He's talking to her like he
entitlement
is
levels
a kindergarten teacher, and she still can't handle it.
It is.
Her entitlement levels are like. I mean, she is the walking case for the estate tax.
Now, the thing I enjoyed about that is Seth Meyers was doing it all with a smile, and I think came off as not being too emotionally invested in it. I get the sense that things were a little bit different at the Meghan McCain home because when she got home or got off the set, there may have been something else expressed that would...
I feel bad for her car driver.
And this is how apparently the Meghan McCain household, her husband, Ben Dominic. Now, listen, before we cut to this, don't cut to what he's writing here. I just want to say, supposedly this was written by Ben Dominic. We have not checked to see if someone else wrote this, and he has just reprinted it without permission. So we're just going to assume that he actually authored this quote. He says, on Twitter, I see that Seth Meyers, the untalented piece of shit, who only has his job because he regularly gargled Lorne Michaels' balls, went after my wife tonight with his idiotic anti-Semitic bullshit.
Yep.
So now apparently, I suspect Seth Meyers might be Jewish. So Ben Dominic is saying that he attacked Meghan McCain with anti-Semitism. The Jew used that special brand of anti-Semitism on the non-Jew. And it's sort of hard to imagine. What does he say after this? Is that the only tweet? Does he have like another one after that that's connected to it?
What does gargling Lorne Michaels' balls have to do with inciting against Ilhan Omar?
I got news for you.
I don't get it.
Lorne Michaels, also Jewish. And here's a guy who's going and gargling Lorne Michaels' balls, still called anti-Semitic just for criticizing.
Yeah, and I got news for you, Ben. I don't think your wife loves you.
Wow. Well, apparently Domenech sort of apologized, but then doubled down at the same time. He wrote in a statement to Mediaite that Seth Meyers is trash. I believe this steadfastly and have for years. He only has his job because of sucking up to the right people. He is an untalented hack. And he apologized for rage tweeting. But then he fired one more final shot and said, I don't like him. I think he's a hack.
Wait, I love how... Wait. You, in the process of trying to like white knight for Meghan McCain, somehow used like any conversation about somebody not having a job in the entertainment industry on merit is definitely not the thing to talk about.
I will say this, okay,
in the process of defending Meghan McCain.
I've been told that Seth Meyers is not Jewish.
His paternal grandfather is Jewish.
Grandfather's Jewish, but apparently
it doesn't matter. Like, he answered Seth Meyers' question very well, I think, when he was like, oh, can we have a conversation about this without throwing around crazy accusations of anti-Semitism?
No, we can't.
We cannot.
I like that. You're unlike Meghan McCain. you don't have a legitimate reason for being on TV.
Since Dominic brought up how people get their jobs and place in society, look at who his father is. Douglas William Dominic, who was Deputy Chief of Staff for the United States Department of Interior, Senior Advisor to Secretary of Interior, and George W. Bush administration appointee. Also, he's recently in controversy here. On April 23, 2019, the Washington Post reported that Dominic was one of 6 officials being investigated for ethics violations in the Interior Department's Office of Inspector General. So
imagine that.
Might be a lot of stress going on at the Dominic House.
What job does little Ben have?
Plagiarist for different conservative outlets, and Face the Nation recurring guest.
That guy gets on Face the Nation?
Of course, he's Face the Nation.
That guy gets on Face the Nation?
Oh, yeah, baby.
Jesus Christ.
What's it take?
And Meghan McCain can't even handle 3 minutes of a nice late-night comic, politely asking her to try to not get Ilhan Omar assassinated.
What, are you a publicist?
What, are you a publicist?
All right.
Oh, yeah, I should stop lying about her. My dad was John McCain, asshole.